Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. I'm excited about our guest tonight, Rebecca Charbonneau. She has written a book called Mixed Signals, and it's about how American and Russian astronomers actually worked together during the Cold War and trying to figure out extraterrestrial intelligent life. We're going to be talking not so much about UFOs tonight, but I am going to be talking a bit about that because, after all, that's why a lot of you people come here to watch the show, The Mystery of UFOs, as they say. Now, I will tell you the blog this week is by Charles Lear, and the title is Promise, Hope, and Disappointment as Another Whistleblower Tells His Story. And this has to do with Jake Barber. I did put a little disclaimer in there because I don't necessarily agree with the whole story. Parts of it are, totally makes sense. But, I let Charles has been writing blogs here. I think it's been 6 years or maybe even longer. And I respect his opinions and I allow and listen to other people's opinions, even whether I agree with them or not. And so anyway, check that out over at podcastufo.com. I think what I'm going to do is bring our guest right in. Rebecca, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So, Rebecca, tell us a little bit about your amazing background, first of all, and then I want to know, what was the catalyst for this book that you wrote?
Yeah, so I have a little bit of an unusual background and an unusual job. So I am a professional historian of astronomy, a historian of science, and I work as a historian at the American Institute of Physics here in Washington, D.C. And I have a background that's a little bit of a mix of science and social sciences and humanities. I have a background in astronomy and art history from my undergraduate days, but then I ended up pursuing a master's and PhD from the University of Cambridge in history and philosophy of science in the UK, before working at institutions like Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, where I did my first postdoc, the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, where I did my second postdoc. So I have a little bit of a strange career path, but it allows me to do things like write books like Mixed Signals. And so I'm very grateful to be able to do that.
Right. Wow. And boy, you're very ambitious to have to do all that. That's amazing. And so you spent some time in Italy, right?
I did. Yes, that's actually what first got me interested in the history of science. I actually had no idea history of science was even a career path one could pursue. At that point, I was kind of an astronomy major turned art history major, and I had won a scholarship to do research on Caravaggio paintings in little churches and chapels all around Italy.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Wow.
it was so fun.
Yeah.
You're 21, 22 years old and getting to, live in Italy and spend your days just walking around looking at beautiful art. It was great. And while I was there, actually, I had some fun summer reading, and I read this book by a historian of science and medicine named Alice Dredger. It was called Galileo's Middle Finger. Which I mostly picked it up because I thought the title was hilarious. Yes, same. And it was actually, it was a bit of an autobiographical book about her career as a historian of science and medicine. It kind of blew my mind because I had no idea that such a job existed that could combine my background in astronomy, but my current passions in art history and history. And the name of the book actually comes from actual Galileo's middle finger, which is preserved as
in a museum.
It is in the Museo Galileo in Florence. And so I was so inspired that I actually took the train from Rome to Florence just to see the glass jar. I was raised Catholic. I'm not practicing anymore, but I don't know if you're familiar in Catholicism, you actually have relics that you go and will visit churches. And it felt very much like visiting a secular scientific relic to see his middle finger. And so, yeah, that was seeing that museum, seeing, all the history of astronomy, the telescopes, the original telescopes owned by Galileo was so exciting and inspiring. I ended up going back to school, the following semester and telling all of my professors that I was going to become a historian of astronomy. And I actually ended up writing, I still was doing an art history degree, so I had to find ways to write history of science papers so I could get into grad school. So I'd kind of find creative ways to do this. Like, in my history of impressionism class, I would do a paper on, the history of chemistry and the creation of paints that artists would use.
Wow.
Or things like that, just to kind of find sneaky back ends into writing history of science.
Well, that's a way you can figure out. I know they test a lot of, paintings, whether they're authentic or not, by the chemistry the compositions of the pigments and, with the other, what chemicals and things they used with them. So I
Yeah.
know there's a lot involved. You could have had that whole career path.
I could have. Yeah, no, there are still actually a surprising number of intersections between the history of science and the history of art. Actually, I did a physics colloquium at Case Western University last month, and there was a scientist there who was studying whether or not you could study fractals in Jackson Pollock paintings to determine whether or not it was an original Jackson Pollock. So yeah, you'd be surprised at how history of art and science are not that far apart.
Wow. Yeah, and Jackson Pollock just used house paint, and there's more fakes than not.
Yeah.
There's a saying something like he painted 10,000 paintings and 20,000 of them are in Connecticut. Like that. But anyway, yeah, that's all fascinating to me because I have been into art. That's what I do for a career is mostly appraisals and things like that. But never these old masters like you're talking about in Italy. But anyway, so that's fascinating. And so, what was the genesis of the book?
So I misspoke earlier, and actually I did my master's degree at the University of Oxford, my PhD at Cambridge. So it started when I was actually at Oxford. I was at the Bodleian Library, which is the main library there at Oxford, and I was doing my master's dissertation. I knew I wanted it to be on the history of the space race. I have always been fascinated by the space race. I mentioned to you before the show started, I'm Cuban American. I grew up on the Space Coast in Florida and Miami. And, I grew up hearing all of these stories about, fleeing communism, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War, having shuttle launches happening just at, not too far away from me. So I knew I wanted to do history in that area because of my personal interest and background. But I wasn't really sure what was going to be a new take on it. The history of the space race feels like it's been written to death, studied to death. There's kind of that same old narrative of competition between the two superpowers.
Yeah.
And I found this book called Intelligent Life in the Universe. It was an out-of-print book, kind of just dusty on a shelf in the Bodleian Library. And I realized that one of the authors, was Carl Sagan, who I have always been a big fan of since since I was a kid. And I was really surprised because I thought I had read everything Carl Sagan had ever written. And I had never read this book. And it turns out that it's no longer in print even. And it was published in 1966, so quite a long time ago. And it also had a co-author who was Iosif Shklovsky, a Soviet astronomer. And I thought that was really weird because, in 1966, it's the height of the space race and the tensions between the two superpowers.
Oh,
and
yeah.
here you have two astronomers, two people who were involved in their respective space races, who've written a book together. And of all things, the topic of finding extraterrestrial life in the universe. So I just thought that was so unbelievably strange. And I needed to know how the book came to be. Like, how did it even get written? And it turned out that was the exact right question to ask because that sent me down a rabbit hole into early efforts by the scientific community to search for extraterrestrial intelligence during the Cold War period.
Wow. Very, very, very interesting. A friend of the show and someone who's been on the show a number of times when I was doing a little bit of research today, because Carl Sagan at one point, I think he was in college and I could not find it. There was some article he wrote or someone captured something that he wrote that he sounded pretty favorable to the idea that, UFOs, not saying necessarily they were extraterrestrial life, but, it's not his saying, but he's known. A lot of people think it is his saying that extraordinary claims need extraordinary proof or something along those lines. But that quote goes all the way back to the 18th century, in different ways. But still, there was something he said, and I just couldn't find it. But I found out today while I was doing a little research that Bryce Zabel, like I said, has been on the show a number of times. He actually debated him on the UFO topic back in, I believe it was 1979 or 1980. So that was interesting.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Carl was highly, kind of in some ways made his career in the UFO world. He was a very young man. I think a postdoc was when he was involved in his first UFO trial in the 60s. So,
oh my goodness, that's fascinating. Here's the article here with Bryce. You can see how young Bryce looks here. But anyway, yeah, that's fascinating. And I know there was this guy that you may not have ever heard of. I don't know how, you're not really. You told me before we started the show that you're not really into looking too much into the UFO topic. But there was a guy named Stanton Friedman. Have you ever heard of that name before?
I have not.
Yeah. It used to be where anytime you'd watch a show on UFOs, Stanton Friedman would be in it. Now, he was a nuclear physicist, but he had a big interest in the topic. But anyway, he talks about sitting backstage with Carl Sagan, and them having a great conversation. And Carl says, "Hey, look, I would be into this topic a lot more if it wouldn't kill my career."
Yeah, I think, yeah. Well, Carl, in some ways, it was surprising how much he still was involved in the UFO question, especially earlier in his career. The book I mentioned, Intelligent Life in the Universe, is kind of exciting. Sorry, I appear to be losing my voice at the worst possible time.
Oh no. Okay.
So it's quite interesting because Intelligent Life in the Universe really is one of the earliest books we have, the earliest texts on the question of intelligent life in the universe from a scientific perspective. And it was so early days in science that, they really weren't sure whether or not there was like a galactic club out there that it would be very easy to detect extraterrestrial intelligence if we happen to just look for it. And because of that, there's a lot of kind of creative thinking in Intelligent Life in the Universe. There's speculation on whether or not, for example, the ancient aliens theory is correct, whether or not there's evidence of past visitation in like Sumerian scrolls, whether or not Phobos, which is one of the moons of Mars, is perhaps an artificial satellite placed there by extraterrestrials, because at that time they knew Phobos had a very strange orbit that indicated that it might be hollow. Of course, we know now that Phobos is actually made of porous rock, which explains the lack of density. But they thought, well, it was just such a free, open inquiry into the topic in the book, because again, they were starting from nothing. And so it's quite a fun early Carl Sagan book, because it really does, you kind of get a little bit of a sense of his creative thinking when it came to the question of life in the universe.
Speaking of that type of theory, how did you feel about when Avi Loeb, who you know who he is because you were at Harvard, when he came out suggesting that Oumuamua could possibly be some type of extraterrestrial? Was that hard for you to consider, or people that colleagues perhaps?
Yeah, so not hard for me to consider. The beautiful thing about being a historian is that I get to really concern myself about the past, not so much the future. It's a really easy get out of jail free card. Of course, I am very curious when I hear theories like Avi's. But I think the nice thing about science, when it is functioning the way it's designed to, as a method and a philosophy, is that you are able to have free discourse and inquiry within the scientific community. You're allowed to posit unique and unusual ideas that are then subject to peer review. And science operates by consensus. And so I think, science has always had people like Avi who throw out strange and unusual ideas. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. I actually think Iosif Shklovsky, who was the co-author of Intelligent Life in the Universe, was a little bit, I think of him sometimes as a little bit like an Avi Loeb type figure. In fact, a lot of his colleagues were kind of famously quoted after his death that, some of his ideas were brilliant and some of them weren't, and you could never really be sure which ones they were, because you need people like that, I think, but then of course you need to let the scientific process unfold, I
agree. Yeah, I agree with you, because think of how stagnant things would be if everything just seemed to be status quo and someone didn't, put out something kind of outrageous that had to be looked at a little more seriously.
Yeah. And it's plausible, right? It is plausible that we could have interstellar, spacecraft. There's nothing that says that couldn't be true. We would just need, at least the scientific community would need evidence, review, consensus. That's just the methods and tools of that community, right?
Yes, I just watched a really great interview today with Gary Nolan. He's a professor. I'm not sure if you're familiar with who he is. He's a professor at Stanford University, and he really thinks that there's something, to the UFO topic. But when he was asked, if he thought there's a term an acronym, NHI, non-human intelligence, that a lot of people, you hear it over and over again, did this craft or whatever, do you believe that these craft were non-human intelligence. And he said, well, with what I know and what I've been told, everything is anecdotal. So I can't go to another scientist that's 10 feet away from me and give them the data and say, okay, you review this and you peer review this type of situation. So he said, until I have that, and he wanted to say that he does think there's something to it, but he just couldn't go there. And I think that's the type of science that's going to keep, the integrity enough to, when they find something that's definitive, that we can go that way. And because otherwise, who's going to believe anything?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that used to devastate me as a child. I was a geeky kid that grew up on science fiction, Star Trek. I was a huge fan of Carl Sagan. And so I wanted nothing more. I used to tell my parents that what I wanted to be when I grew up was I wanted to be an interstellar diplomat. Someone who
You still could be. Yeah.
I still could be. It's not too late. I was very passionate about finding alien life, and I used to be devastated when I would read books by people like Seth Shostak, who we were talking about earlier, or other SETI scientists who would be so skeptical, so shutting down the idea that there is evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. And of course, as I've grown up, I have, become, a researcher in SETI myself. I have learned, the tools and the methods of SETI and of science. And I've started to hear myself say the same things that would have really disappointed childhood me. And I think that, that's the tension in science, right? Is that nobody would be more excited to find evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence than the members of the SETI community. We would be the ones waving the flags, popping the bottles of champagne. But we're trying to do it. Unlike, there's a lot of different groups who are excited about intelligent life in the universe. The SETI community specifically is trying to investigate that question with the tools and the methods of science. And so because of that, we're an empirical field of inquiry. We need evidence. So unfortunately I've become the person who I most wanted not to be as a child.
Well, yeah, you kind of grow into that, I guess. But, I have people often say to me that, oh, so you believe in UFOs, huh? Kind of the eye roll. And I say, there's really nothing to say that I believe in UFOs. UFOs are here. Whatever they are is the question. And to that point, I never really say that I know I still don't know what they are. I've been doing this show and talked to thousands of people, 650 interviews, but there's a lot more than that. But still, I don't know. I have kind of less of an idea of what UFOs are, what's piloting them. And I'm not talking about the ones that can be explained. I'm talking about the ones that have the very strange capabilities that we're unaware of how to, again, if you use science, you wouldn't be able to make something have, 1,500 Gs on right angle turns at, 5,000 miles an hour, whatever it is. So there's still a big question mark. I still don't know what they are, but it's still fascinating. And, someone just asked, are you familiar with a woman named Beatrice Viriel? I can't remember her last name, how to say that. Do you know who Beatrice is? Yeah.
I know just a bit. I've worked, I've gone to a number of SETI conferences to give talks and stuff. And so I remember seeing her name come up, but I can't say that I'm very familiar with her work.
Yeah, she's great. She's been on the show.
Nice.
And she actually kind of made some type of discovery that's really interesting about some stars that were moving that shouldn't have been, or something was really strange. Really something I would say to look into. And I'll invite her back at some point. But it's very fascinating. I do have to tell you, I mentioned earlier off air that I had an astrophysicist on that from NASA, a visiting scientist. And he talked about, I just wanted to get your reaction on this. He said they had water cooler talk with other, scientists there.
Oh, sure.
And he said they basically had the consensus that if an intelligence grew to the point where they could get through the bottleneck of technology without blowing themselves up, they'd probably be traveling the stars and exploring. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that comment.
It's an interesting comment. And I think that this is where my expertise as a historian becomes a little bit more helpful. and that a lot of what I've looked at, and this is again where the Cold War question comes back into our view, which is that we're actually terrible at speculating what the future will look like. We're historically terrible at it, partly because, and this is kind of interesting, the idea of the future or a future is actually a relatively new concept. The idea that technology will impact our lives and change it in a progressive state really can be dated back to like the Victorian era, actually, that's when you start seeing the fantastic Victorian envisionings of, a future with the sky filled with hot air balloons or what have you, or electrical bicycles. That's really when we even start thinking about a future. And then in the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s, as it becomes clear that technology is really beginning to shape life on Earth, we start thinking about the future even more. That's when you start having people like Walt Disney creating Tomorrowland and Walt Disney.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Yeah. You start having lots of science fiction being written about future worlds, or H.G. Wells' time travel, because it's become clear that science and technology has the power to shape our future, where we're going. So the point that it is radically unrecognizable to us, where that wasn't true for a lot of human history, right? 1701 didn't look that different from 1650 or what,
True.
But that's not true from 1950 to 1990, right? Science and technology radically shaped our visions of the future. But it turns out that we're really, really bad at guessing where we're going to be going. And the reason this connects to extraterrestrial life is that in some ways, when we're envisioning what we think extraterrestrial life will look like, we're actually kind of speculating on what we think the future of our own civilization will look like. That's really easy to see, especially in kind of the Cold War era SETI that I study in my research. And so I think that it's a very interesting problem for historians, because we get to look at these ideas of how scientists are envisioning what extraterrestrial life might look like and what civilizations might exist, what technology they might have. And we can usually point right back to something that's happening in Earth right now. Like you'll notice, for example, a lot of the SETI community right now is really focused on the idea of maybe we'll find artificial intelligence in outer space. Maybe that will be the type of extraterrestrial life we run into. Well, it's no coincidence that we think that might be the case, because that's something we're wrestling with right now, right? Yeah. And that's not to say that it's wrong. It's not wrong to think that we might encounter artificial intelligence in space. We very well may, but it's interesting to note that our preconceptions of what's out there are really tied to our perceptions of our own civilization and our own civilization's future. And so that's why whenever I hear scientists speculating kind of water cooler chat like that, I'm always very curious about kind of where they're deriving those ideas and expectations about other civilizations from, because oftentimes it's kind of tied to their view of our own world.
That just makes so much sense, that things I've never even thought of, and one of the things that also that I think a lot of people do when they're speculating is they try to humanize the thoughts and the possibilities of what an intelligence would be. And we have no clue at all about thinking. They say they would never do this or do that or whatever. We don't have a clue because we don't know. We have a human brain. We don't know what another type of brain would be, and how when something evolves, how it evolves. And it has to be, totally different for so many different reasons. Just, little subtle things have changed the way we've evolved. Think if the dinosaurs didn't get wiped out, would we still be here? Would dinosaurs be walking around with our intelligence, developed over the millions of years? Who knows? There is someone that has a thought about that. Mark D'Antonio, who's an astronomer and friend of mine. I want to put up this question right here. So thank you, Chris, for writing this. Looking at the intersection of physics as a discipline and the question of civilized life in the universe, do you think about how universal or generic would science concepts and methods be? Sorry, I kind of bungled that a little, but do you understand?
I do understand the question. Yeah, absolutely. And it's a fantastic question. So I'm very impressed, Chris, because this is something we actually think about a lot in history of science in my discipline as a historian, because there are some. I'll unpack. I'll play both. I'll play devil's advocate and answer it from both sides of the coin. So on the one hand, there's a lot of reason to believe that it might be true that there is some universality to how the tools and methods of science might work, because we do know that there are some features of the universe that are universal, right? We know that the universe is isomorphically distributed, meaning that the same stuff that's here and the same amount and distribution of stuff here is the same as, on the other side of the galaxy, on the other side of the universe. The universe is generally made up of the same stuff. And we know that the laws of physics are also constant throughout the universe, meaning that the laws of gravity here on Earth work the same way as they work, again, on the other side of the universe. So because of that literal universality, there is some reason to expect that, there might be some commonalities we share with extraterrestrial civilizations or life, even if they are very, very far away or very, very different from us. That being said, it's worth, again, turning an eye to our own world and to our own history and noting that even on Earth, the tools and methods of science, or the empirical pursuit of knowledge, epistemology, have been different. There are, for example, some anthropologists who study certain indigenous cultures and show that they actually have really different concepts of mathematics that differ quite radically from kind of the overall Western canon of mathematics. This is super interesting because even amongst our one species, we do see some variance in approaches to things, again, like mathematics, like physics. And if there's such variation even among our one species, then there's some reason to expect that maybe it's not quite as universal of a language as we sometimes think it is. So there's a little bit of a tension between these two things, recognizing, again, the anthropocentrism in the way that we view our systems. We tend to think that the way that we're doing things must be the best and right way, and therefore everyone else would be doing it. But then it's not totally ridiculous to assume that there is some true universality, because we are, again, all using the same tools and materials in the galaxy, in the universe. So yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah. I think we should do, before we get too far here, I would like to talk about how the Russian and, during the Cold War, let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's pretty fascinating, where they work together. And when you talk about the space race, that's something that actually fascinates me too. Sputnik, I think it was 1957, and we're like, the United States thinks they're falling so far behind, and devastated, and really have to do something. And then Kennedy, eventually comes in and say, we're going to the moon, not because it's easy, because it's hard, all that stuff.
Oh yeah.
Really, and unfortunately he never lived long enough to see that, that we actually made it there. But we have a lot of people that still don't believe that we landed on the moon, even though we can actually see the footprints.
Yep. Yeah. No, I didn't mention it, but I also used to work as a graduate student at the NASA history office and headquarters. And one of my jobs was helping to run the NASA history social media pages. And it was, a lot of people who don't believe in the moon landing in the comments of those Twitter. So I'm intimately familiar with that.
Yeah. I actually talked with Alan Bean, fourth man on the moon. And I asked him that question. He was such a nice man. I didn't have him on this podcast. However, I did play the clip. But so I did ask him, I said, well, how do you feel about the people that says you never walked on the moon? And he said, well, it doesn't bother me as long as they're not hurting anyone, and you're not going to convince anyone of anything. You just say, oh, that's nice. I'm glad you think that. Whatever. He was such a cool guy. That's nice. But he got involved in the FBI contacted him about there was stolen moon rocks or something. That was quite an ordeal. But anyway, getting way off topic. So let's talk a little bit about how that all worked out with the during that whole situation where there was so much competition, but yet they worked together.
Yes. Yeah, it's fascinating. So I mentioned Intelligent Life in the Universe, that book, right? That was co-authored by Carl Sagan and Iosif Shklovsky. So Intelligent Life in the Universe is a really weird book. Not only because of it being written by Carl Sagan and Iosif Shklovsky, American, Soviet, 1966, height of the space race, on the topic of ET, but it's also weird just in the way that it's written. If you actually look at the book, you'll see that Carl Sagan will delineate his contributions to the book by inserting his language in between an inverted set of delta signs. And so in some ways, it reads like a conversation between Carl Sagan and Iosif Shklovsky. And the reason that this is the case is because it actually was originally a book that was written by Iosif Shklovsky called Vselennaya Жизнь Разум, which means universe, life, mind in Russian. And it was published in 1962. And it was on, again, kind of the idea of life in the universe. And the reason that it was written was actually Shklovsky was involved in the space race. He had helped independently calculate the transition of neutral hydrogen, which is a really important feature of radio astronomy in the Soviet Union. So he was kind of a big hero in radio astronomy in the Soviet Union. And he got asked to write this book for the 5-year anniversary, actually, of the launch of Sputnik. And he chose to write it on the topic of seeking out extraterrestrial life in the universe because a couple of years prior, he had heard about Frank Drake, who is an American radio astronomer at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, had conducted the first ever scientific search for extraterrestrial intelligence using a radio telescope. And this was called Project Ozma, and this happened in 1960. And interestingly, he looked for extraterrestrial intelligence on the hydrogen line, right? So that wavelength at which we see the transmission of neutral hydrogen. And so Shklovsky was kind of excited because he suddenly, this line that he had helped discover was being used in this very exciting way to be able to potentially seek out evidence of extraterrestrial civilizations. So he wrote this book on the topic of finding ET. And Carl Sagan at the time was just a postdoc. I think he was 28 years old, living in the United States, and heard about Shklovsky's book and really wanted an English translation made because he was already at that young age becoming quite interested in the topic of UFOs, of extraterrestrial life. And Shklovsky said, sure. He was actually really excited and happy Sagan offered to do this because Shklovsky was censored in the Soviet Union for including some important materials in the book, like particularly on astrobiology, biological concepts, because of the history of Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union, basically meant that a lot of biology textbooks were censored, and he wasn't really able to add that material to the book. And so he was hoping that Sagan would add those materials to the book so that it'd be a little bit more complete. Now, Sagan took that invitation a little bit too literally. He ended up, and this is just mind-boggling to me, because he ended up adding so much to the book in the translation that it literally doubled in size. Sent back the translated copy to Shklovsky with his name now also right on the cover, Sagan and Shklovsky. And you have to realize, it was not too long ago that I was a 28-year-old postdoc, and I can't even imagine hearing like a senior scientist asking me to help them with a project and, doubling it and putting my name on the title. It's so cheeky. But Shklovsky had such a good sense of humor, and because he was so happy about Sagan being able to, beyond censors, add to the contents of the book, that it was no problems, and it actually was the start of a really important friendship and connection between the two men that later ended up spawning into a huge collaboration between scientists in the Soviet Union and the United States who wanted to work with one another on the topic of finding extraterrestrial life in the universe. And I think that there is a very interesting reason why this part of the space sciences really was a cooperative one and not a competitive one. And this is because of the internationalism that SETI fosters. Rather than seeing themselves through the veil of, American citizen or Soviet citicism, that nationalism, when they thought of themselves in a cosmic context, they thought of themselves as earthlings. And it made them want to work with one another. And even more critically, they were living under the threat of nuclear annihilation, right? Nuclear Armageddon. And they were, like we mentioned earlier, thinking about their own civilization as they were thinking about seeking life in the universe. And they kind of had to ask themselves the question, like, do technological civilizations that develop things, like the rocket, but the rocket is also what? An ICBM, right? It's capable of destruction as much as it is exploration. And they kind of started wondering, well, maybe civilizations destroy themselves. And so this really prompted them to want to work with one another and to form friendships, because it was more than just science. It was in some ways diplomacy. And so it's an incredibly fascinating area of the history of science.
Right. Reagan said a number of times, if we were visited by an extraterrestrial source, we'd all pull together as one, as humans. And I think that a lot. It's too bad that we can't do a little more of that than, being such a warring world as we are. Here's
Yeah.
a interesting question here. How do the beliefs about UFOs of a scientist differ from those of of a rational non-science, not a non-rational science scientist?
I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great question. I think the answer is a little disappointing, which is to say that I think a lot of scientists don't think about UFOs at all. It's just not that interesting of a question, I think, to a lot of scientists, because it's hard to investigate, difficult to investigate using the tools and methods of science. And even it's funny to say, but even within the scientific community, even things like SETI, which again do use the tools and methods of science, aren't that interesting to a lot of scientists. I used to work, I mentioned, at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. I still work there as an affiliate. If you walk the halls of people who are doing research there, they're interested in things like quasars in active galactic nuclei and star forming regions. They're not thinking about extraterrestrial life. In fact, when I was writing my book, people knew, of course, that I was writing on a SETI subject, and I talked to them about my book. One person said to me, well, what is SETI? This is a person who's at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, which is the birthplace, as I mentioned, of Project Ozma, of the first search for extraterrestrial intelligence. The fact of the matter is just a lot of scientists just aren't thinking about that. It's not their main area of interest.
Yeah. Well, I can see that, and I also understand, when I first started the show, the UFO topic was a lot quieter than it is now.
Oh, yeah.
Back in 2011. So a lot of things have changed since then, but I used to ask, people that were either scientists or involved in science, and they'd say something similar, like there's nothing provable or easily provable or nothing that you can get grant money for because it's nothing that's repeatable.
Yeah.
That type of situation. But to me, it's awful hard to imagine having a scientific mind and not to ponder. I think it's one of the biggest mysteries
Oh, yeah.
that there is. Is there other intelligent life out there? If so, what are they like? Are they here by chance? And if they are, why? And what do they want? That there's all these questions, but the number one is, what is out there?
Yeah, I think you're spot on in that it's just scientists at the end of the day, it's their job, right? They're going to work, they're trying to put food on the table.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, yeah, if it's a question that's not easily answered with the tools and methods of science, if there's not funding available to do it, it's just not a question that's going to get a lot of attention. That may change, right? If it suddenly becomes a question that you can answer with the tools and methods of science, and there is evidence and there is funding, that might radically change. But the way things stand now, you're right that it is changing a little bit with like NASA's involvement, for example, but for the most part, it's just not a question that's very interesting to a lot of scientists.
Yeah, someone just said here that I'm describing a philosopher.
Well, science
Maybe I
used to be
was.
called, well, no, but it's a wonderful observation. I think I like Chris. So I think it's a great observation because actually the word science only came into existence in the 19th century. Prior to that term being part of mainstream usage, we called people who we would otherwise call scientists kind of retroactively, people like Charles Darwin, people like Isaac Newton. They called themselves natural philosophers because what is philosophy at the end of the day? A means to acquire knowledge or understanding. The ways that we have tried to do that have changed over time. We've become a much more empirical society. But philosophy is a very big part of science.
Yeah. Wow. I guess that was a compliment. Thank you, Chris, in some type of way. But no, I think this is a fascinating conversation. And so if I know someone of science never likes to speculate. That's my that's what I've been observing over the years. But how strongly would you speculate that there's other intelligent life?
So I'll answer the question, but I'll preface, you think scientists don't like to speculate. Historians like to speculate even less because
Okay.
we're not in the business of thinking about the future, Martin. We're thinking about the past. But I will humor you because this is a UFO podcast, which is to say that, of course, I mentioned my childhood fascination with extraterrestrial life. It's a question that I have thought about not only in my career, but also in my personal life. I certainly think that I think it's likely that there's intelligent life somewhere in the universe, or that there has been, or that there will be. Whether or not that's at the exact same time that we're existing right now, I don't know the answer to that. And I think that yeah.
I'm sorry, just put this up because I love this quote.
No, it's a great quote. So I do think that I would never claim to believe necessarily, because again, that's outside of the scope of what science is trying to accomplish. But if you think if I perhaps would say that I hope, or that I speculate there may be, and I'm not alone. I think a lot of people in the scientific community, I'm sure you've had people on your show, also think that it's very likely, if not possible, for intelligent life to exist in the universe. Again, largely because the universe is made of the same stuff everywhere. The laws of physics seem to work the same. It definitely happened once. I think we can all agree. Here we are. There's no reason, I think, to assume that it couldn't happen somewhere else. So yeah, I absolutely would be open to the idea of intelligent life existing in the universe.
Yeah,
I hope there is. I genuinely I would love that for us to have, to make definitive first contact in my lifetime. I mean, that would be a dream.
Yeah, I often tell this story because I think it's kind of funny. There's a YouTube video out there somewhere. I saw early on when I started looking into the topic of UFOs, and basically there was a guy in a derby in black and white in 1955 or so saying, "I just want to live long enough to see if there's other intelligent life out there," And so, yeah, I mean, one thing you just said there makes a lot of sense, and a lot of people don't think of it this way. Could be in the past, could be, in the future. For intelligent life to match up at the same time is pretty slim, because of all the way things evolve, and who knows if some society has destroyed themselves and rebuilding again, over millions or perhaps billions of years possibly. So yeah, for them to line up, for intelligence societies or whatever to line up.
It's also a question of lining up communicative ability, because think about this. Radio technology first started developing on Earth towards the end of the 19th century, really didn't get going in a serious way until the 20th and even the mid 20th century, when we started developing, receivers that were strong enough to send signals outside of our ionosphere. So we were detectable through radio means. But already now, more than ever, we're actually becoming more radio quiet as we're starting to use things like fiber optic cables for communications, right? And so there might have been just a very small little blip in Earth history where we were radio noisy and detectable through the means of radio astronomy. And so that's why it's such a difficult question to tackle, because it's not just about an intelligent civilization that we would recognize as intelligent, that exists at the same time as us, that is close enough that we might actually be able to successfully detect, but then also is using the same technology that we're using, so that we would be able to detect or communicate with them. It's very difficult. And again, I think that's why there are really brilliant SETI scientists right now who are not shying away from the anthropomorphic elements of SETI. So take, for example, Jason Wright. He is a SETI scientist at Penn State, at the Penn State Center for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And he does some work on detecting what's called Dyson spheres.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so you're familiar with Dyson spheres. Should I explain for your audience, or should we?
Sure. Yeah.
So Dyson sphere is a theoretical concept that was first posited by American British physicist Freeman Dyson in the 1960s. The idea is that there may be a star somewhere out in the universe that has a superstructure around it, perhaps something like solar panels, something that is harvesting the energy of that star. So sometimes you might hear the phrase alien megastructures thrown around, but Dyson spheres is another term you'll hear. And people like Jason Wright will search for Dyson spheres, even though, like we've discussed, there's really no reason to believe that that technology exists, that it would exist in a way that we'd be able to detect it. But the thinking is that if it exists, if a radio frequency Dyson sphere exists somewhere in our galaxy, it will be the easiest thing to find, because it's the thing that we have thought about, that we would most be able to recognize, and does use something similar to our technology. So again, like technology we'd be able to recognize. And so it's not so much that we're saying Dyson spheres definitively must exist. No, it's just an idea. But the idea is, one that would be pretty easy to find out whether or not it's true. We will know within, a few years, maybe decades, if there are any Dyson spheres in our galaxy, right? We will be able to answer that definitively, which is rare. There's not too many definitive answers in SETI. But I think that's part of why when we talk about anthropocentrism, anthropomorphism in SETI, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's helpful because we're limited by our own perspectives, our own technologies, and that's just where we got to start. That's our sandbox. Because it's hard to imagine all the possibilities.
Yeah, there was a tabby star that they thought, at one time it could have been the Dyson sphere, but they ended up thinking it was, I think, dust, particles or something like that. They think that's what it, I mean, there's so many mysteries still. I just saw the other day and sent the article to my friend who's an astronomer that there's signals coming out of a galaxy that they shouldn't be coming out of. There's so many mysteries.
Oh, yeah.
Well, go ahead.
This is why the study of astronomy is also so important, because the more that we understand about the universe, the less likely we're going to run into a God of the gaps type situation with aliens, where anything we don't understand will then naturally prescribe to being evidence of aliens. Well, no, the more we understand about our astrophysical universe, the more likely that when something really novel and strange comes up, we'll be able to recognize it for what it is. So it's really important that we do kind of astronomy outside of SETI as well.
Here's another question here. How can you tell? Now, I don't know if what he's saying is accurate or not. I just don't know. But how can you tell Dyson sphere from a small black hole, both found because of gravity, but dark?
So I'm not an observer, but my understanding would be that they would give off quite different types of wavelengths of light. So when we're studying, radio astronomy uses radio telescopes, which are big parabolic dishes with a receiver, and they're essentially looking at wavelengths of light that we can't see. Right? They're on the longer end of the electromagnetic spectrum, and different astrophysical objects give off different wavelengths of light, and their spectra look different. And so I couldn't tell you exactly what the spectra of a Dyson sphere would look like. You should look up Jason's papers for that. But I imagine that they differ quite radically from that of a black hole.
I see. Okay, that's interesting. So now let's talk a little bit about the James Webb. Now I know you're more into historian, but I do believe that there's a search for more techno signatures through chemicals in the atmosphere, things like that. So how are you feeling? Pretty optimistic that we may be stumbling across something?
Well, I think it's it's exciting because it's a new type of SETI search, which is actually pretty rare. If you look at the onset of SETI in the 1960s up to where we are now, we've been pretty consistently doing the same thing, which again is using radio telescopes, looking at a small number of frequencies for narrowband signals. Again, looking mostly for transient signals. I'm looking for beacon type signals. We haven't really changed that much the way that we actually conduct the search. So it's really exciting to see that there are kind of new and exciting ideas like looking for, extra pollutants in exoplanet atmospheres. But I'll be the annoying historian again, and I'll just point out that this is, again, a really interesting case of us taking our own observations about our own civilization and projecting them onto what we might expect to find out elsewhere. Because, of course, I've been to a number of SETI conferences recently where exoplanetary atmosphere technosignature studies have been proposed. Oftentimes, they're looking for industrial pollutants, so kind of evidence that there's an industrial revolution happening. Yes. And greenhouse gas effects, things to that effect. And it's just interesting because we're kind of at a point in human history where we're really conscious of the effect that we're having on our atmosphere. We're really conscious of pollutants and the ways that we're impacting things like the ozone layer and the greenhouse gas effects, climate change. So again, it's not a coincidence that suddenly we're like, if we are tainting Earth's atmosphere in such a way that it might be visible from other worlds who are looking at our bio and technosignature, maybe we should look at other exoplanets in the same way. So again, it's great that we're coming up with novel ways to search, and it may well be successful. But again, we do seem to be quite limited in looking for things that reflect our own civilization and the way that we have, acted with our own planet.
Okay, since you're a historian, I'm going to ask you what you think about the WOW signal.
Oh, I love them.
I've talked to Seth about this too. He didn't. Well, anyway, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I don't have too many sophisticated thoughts beyond what I'm sure you've already heard, except for I think the wow signal is fantastic. It's a great bit of SETI history. I've written about it, actually. I think there is a free article I've written about the wow signal on the American Astronomical Society website, in case people are curious to see more. I actually plotted it on a graph, in case anyone's curious. I think there's actually some interesting stuff happening with the wow signal recently, like within the last few weeks. There's a scientist at Arecibo Observatory who's come up with some new theories to explain the wow signal, possibly being linked to a natural astrophysical phenomena. I'll admit that I haven't quite caught up on that paper yet, so I'm going to speak as if I haven't read the new stuff that's come out recently, which is to say that I think the SETI community has generally thought that the wow signal is a very good candidate for what we might expect an extraterrestrial signal to look like. But this is where SETI runs into a really big problem, which is to say that we know that in order for things to be scientific, they need to be verifiable, which means they need to be repeatable. And so I've talked about this with Jill Tarter, for example, who worked at the SETI Institute. Yep. So Jill and I have discussed this, where it's kind of you might get a wow signal that genuinely is a signal from extraterrestrial civilizations, but it does not matter if it does not repeat, because we cannot, as members of the scientific community, definitively say that that is an extraterrestrial signal. Right. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. So someone just put something in there. Has Zeta Reticuli been searched for life? Yes, it has. I know that SETI aimed their radio telescopes at that particular I can't remember what year it was. I think it was in the 70s or 80s or something like that. But yeah, that has been studied. I used to think, well, SETI was kind of ridiculous because they're looking for a signal that, like you said, maybe just used for a very short time. But, I come to think about this after, that it's better than not. They're doing something.
Absolutely.
They're doing something. And whether they're looking for the wrong thing or whatever, there's something that they're proactive on and trying to discover something. So hats off to them for at least trying. And now you're saying that things are changing with how they're looking at things.
There it is. And it's in some ways it's an incredibly creative field, right? Because they are having to think outside of the box for all of the many ways that civilizations might exist in the universe. And it's a little disappointing sometimes to think that we might have a signal like the wow signal that could very well be evidence of extraterrestrial civilizations. But again, we are really trying to use the tools and methods of science. And there's a little bit of an irony here in that humanity actually has not sent very many signals, directed signals to extraterrestrial intelligence ourselves. So there's a little bit of an assumption that people might be sending us messages, but we're not actually doing a whole lot of it ourselves. And even when we have, so like one of the most famous examples of messages we've sent to extraterrestrials was the Arecibo message that happened at Arecibo Observatory in 1974 by Frank Drake, who also did Project Ozma. And interestingly, that was a one-off, radar pulse from the Arecibo telescope. It might have looked something like the wow signal from another planet, right? Very strong, and maybe a bit weaker because the wow signal was quite strong. Arecibo was a little bit not quite that strong. But it's interesting to think that we're looking for something that we're not bothering even sending out ourselves. So I've always found that funny.
Yeah, and the Voyager, for one, I don't know if you remember. I think it was a Star Trek movie about V'ger.
Yes, yeah.
But I mean, the Voyager is really something. Carl Sagan had, something to do with that, and the gold-plated record and all that, the information, which I think is fascinating. And that I understand the signals come back from that. It was lost for a while, but
they are communicating, they are transmitting to us. Yeah. And I love the Voyager golden record. I think that so actually maybe you'll appreciate this as someone who works in the arts world. I've written about this in my book. I actually think that the Voyager golden record is a fantastic example of art. I think of Carl Sagan as an artist, not just a scientist, because it was in so many ways really a piece of concept art, right? To create this beautiful work that has, the pulsar map, the sounds of Earth, the greetings in the many different languages, and he created the Pioneer plaque, which preceded that, which was on the Pioneer probes. So I think of messages that we send to other worlds as also in some ways works of art, and so I think that Carl Sagan was a bit of an artist.
And wasn't there artwork also like something representative of, say, Andy Warhol or something
Oh
like that?
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And there's been we send all kinds of art into outer space. Even on the moon, right? There's a statue, the fallen astronaut, a little sculpture that went up with I think it was Apollo 17 or 15. So yeah, absolutely. We it seems to be actually that art is one of the biggest vehicles through which we communicate with the universe, which I think is a bit nice.
Well, I do too, and I think of art, and I think of music as vibration music.
Oh yeah,
I mean, if intelligent life is out there, they must be, enjoying that as well. Thank you so much. And your
of course.
book is Mixed Signals, and it's in the link in the show notes and down below in the text. So it's been a real pleasure, Rebecca. You've been
Absolutely.
fun to talk to.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, take care now.
You too.
All right. All right, everyone. So I'll be back next week with Bob Salas. I'll be up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, but I will be back with him on this show next week, same time. So thank you all for being here tonight. And remember to keep your eyes to the sky.